District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Listeners who boat and fish, I have a special guest on the program today. We're talking with Gettys Brannon from the South Carolina Boating and Fishing Alliance. He made an appearance in some of my recent reporting in ICAST, and he's here to talk about the state of recreational fishing and boating, not only in South Carolina, but a little bit across the country and largely here in the mid-Atlantic, eastern United States. Eastern seaboard is rather a more accurate picture. So Gettys, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Gabriella, thank you so much for having me, and enjoyed our time in Florida together. And I know there were a lot of good fishing companies down there that had a lot of good information for you.
It was a wild show. It was super busy. You caught me at like my busiest, but it was good to connect with you, and I appreciated your musings and your insight into what is happening, even beyond the products and different gear that is showcased there. So some people who might be listening might be familiar with your background. You told me you did some competitive fishing as a college student. You're really steeped in the boating and fishing industry, but what led you to become interested in fishing and boating?
I grew up about 40 miles south of Lake Norman in upstate South Carolina. And so the closest lake was actually in North Carolina. So we go to Lake Norman. Family had a house there, grew up fishing there. And started fishing night tournaments, night bass fishing tournaments. My theory there is that the traffic can be so bad on those lakes near Charlotte that all the fishermen just want to fish at night, so you get away from a lot of the boat traffic. And so got into some competitive fishing there on Friday nights, Saturday nights kind of thing, and it was a good time. And then I came to the University of South Carolina, and as a freshman, joined the fishing team here, and was very fortunate to become the president of the fishing team, and then later win a national championship in 2015. And it was all gas from there. We went and traveled across the country and got to see a lot of beautiful lakes and rivers, and had a really good team. My former college teammates, now a Bassmaster Elite Series fisherman, Patrick Walters. And so it was an enjoyable time. And speaking of Bassmaster, that was my next logical step. I was in the journalism school and went straight to work for Bassmaster in college and stayed with them for a few years out of school as well. And Gabriella, what we figured out is during that time, the folks that I was working with at Bass, we all started to see that there was so much boating and fishing commerce out of the state of South Carolina. And my time before fishing, or I should say before competitive fishing in college, was spent as a page at our state house. And so you start figuring out how many different interests are represented at your different state capitals across the United States. But right in front of you sometimes is where you can make the biggest difference. And just seeing that there was no one there to talk about recreational boating and fishing issues really motivated me. And that's what helped me start the Boating and Fishing Alliance. We started in COVID at the end of 2020 and publicly launched in 21. And it was just, it's been a true blessing to be able to bridge together and marry things that I truly care about with politics and fishing.
How many boat and fishing manufacturers, I think you could speak more to the boat side, but how many companies are in South Carolina? Because I know a lot of major brands are in the Charleston region, and you have talked about before that there are a lot of boating manufacturers. So list how many numbers-wise you guys have.
Absolutely. So we have quite possibly the greatest economic mix of boating and fishing companies in the entire world. We have the 3 largest fishing tackle manufacturers in the world, and we have 28 boat makers. And so when you talk about the 3 largest fishing tackle manufacturers in the world, you have Pure Fishing that's in Columbia. You have Lewis and Strike King, which is Rather Outdoors. They also own Zebco now over in Lexington, South Carolina. And then you have Shimano that's down in Ladson, which is right outside Charleston. Some of our boat companies, I'll get in trouble if I try to name them all, but we have, I think out of the top 10 consumer boat brands in the world, It's something like 5 or 6 of them are made here in the state of South Carolina. So there's a lot of volume that comes out of here. And it is a huge, huge industry. Boating means business here. It's a $6.5 billion industry, and we support over 27,000 jobs. And that's not even counting the recreationalists that make up the 500,000 boats that are registered here in the state of South Carolina.
I don't think most people know how vested and deep-seated the industry is. And I think all across the Eastern Seaboard, cumulatively, it's like almost 1 million jobs, lots of, I think, billions of dollars in economic footprint or economic output, rather. And South Carolina does take up a big chunk of that. And I've spent some time in South Carolina. I've actually fished in Myrtle Beach offshore for shark fishing, heard about the red snapper issue from some of the fishermen there. I've seen a little bit visiting Charleston what the boating industry looks like. I recently caught my largemouth bass actually in Lake Marion, and that was really cool, and a lot of good watercraft. Yeah,
Antique Cooper is it's one of the best bass fishing lakes in the world. We have a lot of good freshwater resources. I know that a lot of our issues focus around saltwater, but man, there are a lot of good bass fishing lakes in South Carolina, and I'm originally a sweetwater guy, so I tend to trend towards that. But we have gotten to do a lot of saltwater fishing here lately.
You guys have a lot of offerings, and I used to drive over whenever I would go south on I-95 to Florida or Georgia or something. Always would pass by Lake Marion, got to fish it recently a couple months ago, loved it. So you guys have a lot of offerings, of course, with respect to recreational boating and fishing. But I think a lot of people who are listeners of this podcast maybe underestimate how these activities, which are supposed to be fun, you don't think there's any kind of obstacles to them, they often become political. And you very well know this. And I think a lot of people listening know this, or people in my network even know this too. But why have fishing and boating become so political when they shouldn't be?
The simple answer to that is there is no simple answer, but the easiest way I could describe it is you have the environmentalists that do not know how to balance the economy and ecology. They make every decision they make based off of how many trees are going to be there the next day instead of figuring out how many trees they're going to plant to continue for the next generation. And so you see that same environmentalism and that same philosophy in boating and fishing issues. To me, outdoors people are the original conservationists. I mean, hunters and anglers are the original conservationists. They want fishing and they want the fish. They want whatever species they're after. They want whatever, not to get into hunting a lot, but they want whatever deer they're harvesting or whatever that might be. They want that to be there for the next generation. This is a game management and fisheries management is super important to what we do. At the end of the day, the water is our golden egg. And if we don't protect that, then our industry will not thrive. And so there shouldn't be as many competing interests as there are, Gabriella, but as you well know in the work that you've done on the policy side, it's like this with wind energy. It's like this with, I'm sure we'll get into the right wells in a little bit. It's like this with red snapper. We're seeing these far extreme groups that are pressuring the federal government and the unelected bureaucrats to make decisions that only are reflective of the non-user groups. We can't have the bird watchers and the trail walkers telling us how these areas need to be managed. And so having a good voice and having a strategically sound and smart voice there too, we need data as well. And there should only be drastic measures taken when the appropriate data is available. And what we continue to see is it is a continuous cycle of making decisions without sound data.
Right. You alluded to it being something that has kind of plagued hunting, but it is starting to trickle into fishing and boating. Not as overtly, but they have done little death by 1,000 cuts with lead tackle prohibitions or phase outs retroactively and some other different gestures, which we'll go into shortly. But I don't know if people know this, even outside of South Carolina's individual footprint. In total across the United States last year, for fiscal year 2024, there were nearly $383 million generated from the Sport Fish Restoration Program that went back to conservation in all the 50 states. I bet South Carolina got millions of dollars to appropriate to different let's say, habitat restoration or fish stocking programs. I know in Virginia we do that with the monies that we get from Fish and Wildlife Service. And then in total, since Dingell-Johnson became law, it's $8 billion has been generated, over $8 billion. So people kind of underestimate the impact that fishing and boating have in this country. Definitely hunting does take a big chunk because of the guns and ammo purchases, but people also neglect to understand that fishing does have a big footprint as well, conservation-wise and also for the economy when they craft these regulations.
Yeah, Pippin Robertson and Dingell-Johnson, respectfully, in both the industries, have done more for conservation than there's any credit given. And you bring up a great point. I mean, if you would think about the excise tax dollars that these three behemoth tackle companies pay into the Sport Fish Restoration Fund, I'm sure. And now you're going to get me into states' rights. I'm sure South Carolina doesn't get the majority of it back, but we're probably paying a lot of it forward. So thank your South Carolina tackle manufacturers next time you see them at a Academy, Dick's, Bass Pro Shop, or your local tackle shop.
What people don't understand, though, and I've had to kind of educate our hunting and shooting sports brethren, they think if you take away this excise tax, and people who don't understand tax policy will think it's an income tax or some regressive tax like that. It's not. It's a tax paid by and levied by the manufacturers. And even if you got rid of it, even on the fishing side, you don't see a decrease in price because prices for items are determined by supply and demand. That's largely where it is. So I wanted to throw that caveat there. But even though it has such a big economic footprint, lots of millions of dollars, as I said, and billions since 1950 have gone to conservation, we still see this rulemaking. We talked about this a little bit before. We see rulemaking specifically targeting fishing and boating. And again, it's not as overt as like the hunting side has been, but people on this show know, and people who regularly listen to my podcast or read my musings know that the efforts to lower vessel speed rules all across the eastern seaboard from coastal Massachusetts to Florida, and then just prohibiting or limiting red snapper season. I think it was one day. Also different rules relating to the Rice's whale, which is very similar to this vessel speed rule for the North Atlantic right whale, and just other different regulations that are going to make fishing and boating harder. So where does your organization fall into this, and what engagement have you done to stop this rule from going into effect or kind of shed light on the negatives associated with it?
So access is certainly at risk, and without access, our industry will not be able to continue. And at the end of the day, there are groups of people out there that don't want us on the waterways, and they don't want there to be usage on the waterways. You and I talked in Florida about some of the precursors, some of these crazy rules that we see. One of the main ones was the 30 by 30 rule. I mean, when you look at taking away 30% of land and 30% of the water with no take and no use, and fun fact for the listeners, South Carolina was the third state behind California and Hawaii to introduce that bill in 2020. We successfully defeated it. And I don't know that it'll ever be introduced here again, but anytime you're following environmental policy from California and Hawaii, and I know, Gabriella, you're partial to California, but if we're following it from an environmental perspective, South Carolina might not be in a great place. But we've seen these progressive rules that continue to just take away from our industry. You see in 2008 that this rule was put in place on boats over 65 feet. And I want to point out that we actually pointed out in our public comment letter from the South Carolina Boating and Fishing Alliance to NOAA, which is all public record, that the enforceability of this rule is just not feasible. And I want to say it was 2 or 3 months later, there was at least one boat, maybe two, but I have seen the physical copy from one boat in Charleston that got a $15,000 ticket in the mail for an alleged violation of the vessel speed rule from 2 years prior. 2 years prior. And the way they sent this was via AIS. So essentially, if you were going down the road in your car with your GPS on and you were going 50 in a school zone, and 2 years later, you got a ticket in the mail from the Highway Patrol or your local police saying, hey, we caught you on August 1st of 2024 going 50 in a school zone in 2026. That's the sort of stuff we're looking at here. This is big brother. This is big government overreach of this worst kind. And so not only do we have issues with the way the current rule is being enforced, we have extreme issues with the lack of data and the lack of science that's going behind the new rule that they're trying to put in place. And mind you, as you've written wisely in your columns, they're now trying to do this after the election. They're waiting until November now, which this should have already been promulgated or it should have already been taken to the courts, wherever it's going to end up going. And so if you look at the rule now, which will be over 35 feet, boats over 35 feet, there are huge discrepancies in this rule. Their economic analysis alone was completely off. And I'll pull up the exact number, but just in South Carolina alone, we estimate we would lose $77 million just in lost sales revenue to the current inventory that exists. And I am pretty sure for the entire United States. So in this rulemaking process, we've had terrible data and flawed assumptions based off of the data. If you look at the economic data alone in South Carolina, it will cost $77 million just on the inventory that exists on 35-foot and above boats now, just based off of our South Carolina Boating and Fishing Alliance dealerships. NOAA estimated in the entire United States that it would only be a $46 million hit. $46 million to little old South Carolina, $77 million. And that's just based off of a quick survey we did. We don't even know that we captured all of the boat dealers in the state by the time we had to respond. And so you're seeing this when the administration and NOAA started seeing these shortcomings in their data, they should have withdrawn the rule and went back to the drawing board. Because here's another thing that you won't hear any of the well people say and any of the environmental groups say, and mind you, we're all well people. Let me actually hit on that for a second. We're all conservationists. We care about the whales. We don't want to hit the whales. At the end of the day, we go out there to look at nature as well. But we're trying to take a solution-driven approach when there's not a problem. And what I mean by that is in the state of South Carolina, over the past 52 years, we've only had one serious vessel strike. You have a better chance of being struck by lightning than hitting a well. And so all that coupled together with terrible economic assumptions, and keep in mind, these are the same folks in the first draft of the rule that said the draft of a recreational vessel was the same draft as a cargo ship. I mean, say you don't know something about something without saying it, right? I mean, it ignores every advancement in marine technology that's available. It ignores common sense above all. And so not only that, it completely ignores boater safety as well. So when you're driving your boat at 10 knots, you can't plane out. It messes up your line of sight. And actually, if you want to get into the drafting conversation, you have more of a draft when your boat's going slower. So if you're going faster, more of the boat's actually out of the water. And so we're finding all this stuff, and it just begs the question, what is NOAA and what is the Biden and Harris administration doing with this?
Obviously not following the science as it relates to this, because they're using, I would say, evidence or lack thereof evidence, or rather materials concocted by environmental groups that are very steeped in with this administration to put out really faulty science, largely leaning on emotion, not data or facts, to justify this slowdown. Going by their logic, they're fine with sacrificing this very important multi-billion-dollar industry, which, again, would affect would see nearly 1 million jobs affected should this rule go into effect. Now we're seeing more delays. And as you mentioned, after November, I think they're putting certain interests, and I talked about this with you offline before, but in my estimation, I feel like they're putting ocean industrialization, namely offshore wind development, not so much affecting you, but it is affecting my state and a couple other areas, New England especially, New Jersey, and then a little bit here in the mid-Atlantic. They seem to be putting that interest with its many unknowns and actually potentially more harmful impacts on the North Atlantic right whale. There is a NOAA fishery scientist who said and warned the administration that if you proceed like this, you're going to impact the North Atlantic right whales migration pattern. You're going to affect their eating habits with plankton and so many other very concerning impacts that would come from fully scaling up offshore wind. So to me, it seems like they've put that interest above boating and fishing. And that's why we're seeing this kind of disconnect and favoring or disfavoring rather of the fishing and boating industry over that. That's just my theory into it. I'm kind of a cynic, but it seems like they've put certain untested, perhaps more preferential industries, which get a lot of government backing. To me, it seems like they can't co-opt fishing and boating with subsidies as much, unless they want to do electric boats. But that's a whole nother story and conversation. Something that'll never materialize given water and electricity don't mix. But that's just kind of my estimation. They seem to be putting different interests above fishing and boating. They could care less about fishing and boating.
And to your point, as the debate continues to spread, it's become apparent that the whales are a part of a much bigger picture. I mean, if you look at the environmental groups that are pushing this, they're beginning to link the 10-knot speed rule not to whales, not to whale safety, certainly not to human safety, but to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. The International Fund for Animal Welfare has published materials explaining that a 10% reduction in global ship speed reduction, I should say, would reduce the overall greenhouse gases by around 13%. So there are solutions to save the whale. Those exist. But it's becoming a lot clearer to me and our cohorts in different states that this might be a larger part of a different political agenda. And I know that is not a place we necessarily need to go today, but it's worth noting that on the particular handouts and leave behinds, they're starting to talk about greenhouse gases. They're starting to talk about Green New Deal talking points, and that has nothing to do with actually saving these majestic animals. And so going back to your point on the technology and hitting my point on the $15,000 ticket one more time is this rule is not the most effective way to reduce the risk of vessel strikes to North Atlantic right whales. The technology is there, it exists, and there are multiple more iterations of technology that are in development. The agencies that propose this rule, NOAA in particular, did this without any consideration, did this without any consultation with the boating and fishing industry. And heck, they even had a technology workshop more than a year and a half later after they proposed the rules. So those of you listening, this is going to be a 3-year. I mean, we're coming up on at least 2 years. It might be even longer than that we've been working on this. And so there are different plotting technologies. There's 3D mapping. There's infrared imagery. There's heat maps. There's all sorts of ways that we can start to plot out where, because keep in mind, one of their main messaging points is there's 300 and something breeding females left. Well, at the end of the day, if we can track all of these great white sharks in the comfort of your phone on an app, you're telling me we can't figure out how to the same agencies who's supposed to be America's science agency cannot figure out how to track an animal that's larger and there are many less than. So a lot of this just doesn't make sense. And the privacy aspect of this, going back to the $15,000 ticket, and that's not an exaggeration. These are the tickets that are going out for this previous rule. This raises serious privacy concerns, and it could even violate constitutional rights of recreational boaters. It's a requirement to keep the AIS system on, and AIS is meant for safety. It's meant for the people on board and the crews to keep themselves safe, and they're able to track them easier if they're supposed to be, if they have any sort of issue. But this is not supposed to be used for issuing speeding tickets several months or years later. And so it's really big government at its worst, Gabriella. And I hope that the Chevron deference case and some of the other ways that the Supreme Court and others have tried to crack down on the administrative state will ultimately help fisheries and crazy environmental rogue policy that lifelong bureaucrats who are unelected and unaccountable to boaters and anglers or hunters in this case can just do whatever they want. And so hopefully that some of these changes in the courts will change this up and it'll help us be able to move forward.
That accountability is likely coming. I think there is an appetite for Congress to do its job and create rules, or rather amend or modernize rules. And so we may see that depending upon how November goes. But going largely to that Chevron deference point, to these climate considerations, which are very extraneous to the conduct and management of fisheries. Some in our industry may disagree with us, but if you put climate considerations over access and you start to recognize that both are not being adhered to, you can see and recognize that they care more about this kind of extraneous goal over maintaining access and then also simultaneously conservation of endangered North Atlantic right whales. So I think a lot of people are coming to realize that when you put these extraneous factors above management, above conservation, above access, you lose all of that. So you're trading, for some semblance of virtue signaling, and then you simultaneously lose access and you get 30 by 30, which could be 50 by 50, which would potentially block off access. And you mentioned my connection to California. Listeners know I'm from California, and we had marine life protection areas in the state, which were kind of the precursor to 30 by 30. And that's a really flawed policy. American Sport Fishing Association has done extensive research and has noted that access that becomes blocked off for restoring areas, their MPAs, they never restore access. And that's my worry with whether creating no-go zones, slow-go speed zones, marine sanctuaries that are unchecked. All these little prohibitions or death by 1,000 cuts could eventually lead to the ocean becoming off limits to recreational boaters and anglers. And that's just kind of how you track things when you work in politics and see the connections and the gesturing from different executive orders, press releases. That's where they ultimately want. They don't care about recreational boaters and anglers. They love to tout that Dingell-Johnson amendment funds are going to the states. They love to highlight that. And then they attach, bipartisan infrastructure, IRA to that to kind of dilute the importance of the different excise taxes and the monies that come through those two pivotal laws. So the goal, unfortunately, if we were to see this kind of gesturing by this current administration continue, my worry is we see even a loss of fishing and boating access.
And I completely agree with you. And it's not even just scare tactics or any sort of positioning from our side to say that this could ultimately happen. But how much more extreme can you get than putting a 10-knot speed limit on boats? Like it doesn't even make sense, right? And so not only that, Gabriella, look at what they've done in the South Atlantic fisheries with red snapper. We had 1 day of snapper fishing this year. 1 day.
Ridiculous.
And every time, so I took some members of the South Carolina football and basketball team out fishing the day after, went for the 1 day of snapper fishing. And it made me realize how crazy this regulation is, because we were catching them on every single cast dropping down. And these guys, some of them had been offshore before, but many of them hadn't. They would look at me and say, "Man, why do we have to throw these fish back?" I said, "They're endangered." They said, "Well, if they're endangered, how are we catching them?" And it's just like those sort of interactions with folks makes you realize how off the entire regulatory process is, especially for red snapper. And hopefully what we can do is start bringing state control back to our snapper fishery, because I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but in September of 23, NOAA admitted for the third time in 13 years that their data was 30 to 40% off on their MRIP data, which is how they come up with how many days we're going to have for snapper season. So in what other business can you make decisions off of 40%, off of numbers that are 40% wrong? You don't. And if you do, you get fired. And so they need to quit using federal taxpayer dollars to do this, and they need to send it back to the states where we know what we need to do and we know how to fund it. And, in fishing, and I know you're a fisherwoman, if you get a bite at one spot, it's, maybe a little bit of luck. If you get a bite in a similar spot, it could still be somewhat of a fluke. But after you get that third bite, that's a pattern. That's what you lock into. And so they have a pattern of bad data. They have a pattern of mismanagement. This is not a fluke. This is not something that just has happened, right? This is something that continuously shows that our models are wrong. And we have a great congressional delegation in South Carolina with Senator Lindsey Graham and Congressman Russell Fry currently leading this charge for us on red snapper and the right well issue. And so, listeners out there, make sure your congressional delegation is up to speed on this stuff and let them know that at some point the industry is just not going to stand for this anymore. And I think the industry is finally to a point where, with what we saw in the Gulf a few years ago, they went from having 3 days to now having 153 days because of state management in those waters. And so state management is a tried and true method. We have to get the money for it, and we have to make sure our state natural resources departments are ready to do it. But we've got to start trending in that direction, because the federal government has proven time again that they're not up for the job. And so it is constant issues more federally. And I tell you too, Gabriella, we talked about freshwater fishing a little while ago. I was at ICAST, largely there's a ton of bass anglers there, a lot of them that I worked with at Bassmaster. And I said, man, y'all just have it so lucky, because, the freshwater issues are so much easier to talk about and so much easier to figure out, because you can work with a state legislative body and you can usually figure out what's going on with those with good common sense. But when you start talking about saltwater issues and you're talking about federal waterways, or you're talking about an entire region of the United States, it is extremely hard to get anything done.
It is. And when you have an uncooperative government, it does not help, especially one that acts as an impediment to conservation while saying that they're doing conservation, but obviously doing the opposite. Gettys, where can people connect with you and learn about your organization's work and efforts?
Yes. So the best way to connect with us is www.scbfa.com. Our Instagram is at SCBFA. Our X is at BoatfishSC. And we have a bunch of social media channels that we work through. But we're always open for comment. We're always open for other businesses joining us, even if you're in another state and you're listening and you want to join the fight and help us out to keep sportsmen and sportswomen on the waters. Please feel free to reach out on our website. And Gabriella, thank you so much for the time today. And I can't thank you enough for what you do, and shining a light on these issues is super, super important. And it's important just to show that outdoorsmen and women can be great conservationists without being purely green environmentalists. And it is, it's bad because our industry has always been risk averse, and we don't want to get into, any sort of political fights. But at the end of the day, when they're starting to take away access, you have to call a spade, and you have to start figuring out the best way to fight this thing. And we have very much bipartisan support in our state with what we do. And this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is a common sense issue. And, conservation's a team sport. So the more ideas and the more opinions we can have at the table to figure out how we keep access and protect and conserve our environment and our waterways, the better we'll be for it.
That's sound advice and well said. It is a bipartisan activity. It shouldn't have to be partisan, but sometimes it can be. I appreciate you coming on and sharing all that you know and the latest in fishing and boating, especially from the standpoint of a South Carolinian, a very important state here on the Eastern Seaboard. Thanks, Gettys, and let's revisit again soon.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.